New to the storage world, but not new, of course, in the industry as a whole, is NAND flash as non-volatile storage. Now you're starting to have storage components, non-volatile storage components, that can keep up with this insane amount of I/O and the amount of performance that these CPUs are providing. Interconnects are getting ever faster. You have 10 gigabit Ethernet moving on to the motherboard in the next year or two. You have InfiniBand, which is at 40 gigabits. They've got a roadmap to 100 gigabits. Wow. And of course, our friend PCI Express Gen 3. So the interconnects are scaling to match the raw performance of the CPUs and, even solid state memory. So what this means is that you're going to be able to sort of make a quantum leap in terms of performance and scalability, once again, with commodity components. And of course, anytime you get an inflection point, that spells opportunity. So as I mentioned, I think we're at a new inflection point here for storage. Some of the implications I think that this has here is that hybrid storage, sort of a concept we pioneered with ZFS, where you have a mixture in the same cohesive storage pool of solid state storage and rotating rust, as they call disk drives, will become ever more commonplace. It's really, I think, just given the factors of feeds and speeds, if you will, involved, is kind of inevitable. Concurrency is going to become the new paradigm. Something very interesting is the idea in your operating system of doing I/O. Make a system call, context switch into the kernel, grab some big I/O lock, send an I/O down to a device and come back. When I'm talking millions of I/Os a second, which the new hardware will allow me to do, I can't afford a context switch, much less grabbing some lock that was designed to have, hundreds of things going on per second, not millions of things going on per second. So fundamentally, a new way of talking about concurrency in the OS and in your storage protocols, I think, is going to be required. You're starting to see this with Intel and Micron and IDT and so many other companies, and Microsoft, I believe, working on a protocol that's an alphabet soup in and of itself, ENVMHCI, or the Enterprise Non-Volatile Memory Host Controller Interface. One of the things that they've sort of pioneered with that is that the idea of having a request response queue is no longer, I have a device, I have a single request response queue. It's, I have a device, because of the NAND flash, the number of NAND flash components sitting behind it, is capable of an immense amount of concurrency in and of itself. Hundreds of NAND chips back there, each of which can be doing something independent of the others. Now, instead of being able to talk through a single request response queue, which is kind of silly when I have all that concurrency waiting for me on the back end, with ENVMHCI, I can actually create many, many individual request response queues. And to each requester, it appears they've got nobody else to talk with. So imagine I have a system with, say, 64 cores in it. Every core on the CPU could have its own individual request response queue. No locking at the OS required. Hell, I could even do the talking up at the application level, because I can create my own private request response queue with the underlying storage and not have to worry about even making a context switch in the OS, not grabbing a lock with anybody else. Bam, I've got instant access. If it turns out that there is a concurrency issue at the back end when I finally get to the NAND devices themselves, well, that's the place you need to manage your concurrency, because that is the fundamental resource that can be contended. The actual actions that a NAND device can be performing at one time. And so what I think this means is that with concurrency being essentially required to get the underlying performance from the hardware, and the hardware scaling to where these previously insane levels of performance were impossible, I think something has to give in terms of the protocol and transports that are used today. iSCSI over Ethernet just isn't going to give you that sort of level of concurrency. You're fundamentally going to need to talk about something else. So that's really all I have to say about that, as someone once said. And any questions from anybody today, or comments, concerns? Rotten tomatoes, yes.
So this is a report of the NVMe. It's been around for a couple of years, but what's the real status?
NVMHCI was a sort of, I would call it a failed standard. eNVMHCI is really a brand new protocol. I have no idea why they chose to keep the connection with NVMHCI, but it's fundamentally a new thing designed with all these new constraints in mind. Again, I'm not sure it'll become the new standard, if you will. I'm not sure it'll be any more successful than NVMe HCI, but I think the concepts that they're exploring there, that is, that concurrency is sort of a first-class citizen, if you will, that the actual communication between the processor and the underlying device should be structured such that the things that are expensive, which is a CPU doing a read across PCI, because that blocks that CPU from literally doing anything else for hundreds of, tens of microseconds. That's the thing you want to avoid. So you just want, posted writes in both directions. You want to design the protocol around the underlying building blocks. And I think that's something they've done in a very interesting way. They seem to have thought about it very carefully. So while I'm not saying even HCI will be a successful protocol, I think some of the ideas they're exploring will find their way into whatever is the new successful protocol out of all this. Any other questions? Yes.
You maybe say a few words about the NVMe and flavor, like general ideas on the operating system that you're, for this. I go, you do pilot, man. Well, you deal with the concurrency, let me know what's up.
Exactly, and that's a very typical model in just about anything today, which is you have, fiber channel devices have been doing this for years, which is the classic request response queue. I have a request queue that the device monitors that I just, as you say, feed in a bunch of stuff, go do these, and then when you're done, over here in the response queue, tell me how it went, and specifically when you're done. And the notion of having, so many things have these, and some even in devices you're starting to see have more of them, but these guys have taken it to a whole new level where literally you can have 64,000 request response queues for a single device. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to take the concurrency management out of the operating system. Because if I have a device that only has one request response queue, and I have several threads or several applications wanting to talk to that device, I have to fundamentally have a lock in the operating system that protects that request queue and serializes access to it. Whereas if I have, say, for every process or every thread, a independent request response queue, I don't need to do locking. If you structure things right, heck, maybe I don't even need to make a system call. Maybe I don't even have to do a context switch. I can save a lot of time and a lot of worry about concurrency just pretending I'm the only one in the world talking to this device and just going at full rate, not worrying about what anyone else is doing, with the actual concurrency resolution happening in the device itself. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah, one of the problems there is with Flash, it's extremely non-uniform in access time. And so if you look at CPUs, the thing they like to talk to is DRAM, and that's like 50 nanoseconds away. And as I mentioned before, because, of the the superscalar architectures in most CPUs, that's equal to a couple hundred instructions. And that's 50 nanoseconds. If instead I'm talking, say, 80 to 100 microseconds, that's a virtual forever for a CPU. So using that as a non-volatile storage for, main memory for a CPU, probably not going to happen. Phase change offers some hope in that area, in that access times for phase change are still asymmetric, but the constants are a lot lower. They're, in the tens to hundreds of nanoseconds, which brings it much closer to something that a CPU could directly talk to. The problem, as I mentioned before, is, 2013, 2014, they're looking to have parity with DRAM costs. So it's not going to be cheaper, but it could be that it'll be non-volatile. Of course, that introduces a whole new host. What do you do when all the memory in your computer is non-volatile? That's going to be sort of a very interesting question for the OS researchers, because all of a sudden, what does it mean to reboot? If I have a few terabytes of non-volatile memory, it's going to take a while to rebuild all that state that I've accumulated after a while. A reboot is no longer something you're like, yeah, whatever. It's like, wow, I just lost several terabytes of state that the OS has to either rediscover again because it's non-volatile. And of course, if it was due to an OS crash, which part of that state is valid? I don't know. Could I roll back a kernel data structure and have it revision functional? I don't know. But it's some very interesting questions in that regard. So NAND flash, I don't think, will be, a non-volatile memory option for CPUs anytime soon. But there are other technologies coming in the future which very well could be. That'll open up a whole new host of opportunities and interesting questions.